So yes, as Ellen said, this panel will talk about, well, who's going to win. And we can do lightning rounds, but I come more from a political science tradition and wanted to get also beyond, not beyond or before the horse race part of it, of understanding the nature of the race, what horses are in it and why, what does the track look like, are the mudders going to win or the dry, that'll expend my knowledge of horse racing. But I thought I'd like to divide it into sort of three thematic sections of how did we get here, where are we, and where are we headed. Not terribly complicated. So, but to open with the panelists, get their opinion of how did we get here. So, how did we get to 12, 10, 8, however many candidates we have on the Democratic side? And how did we get to these 12, 10, 8, whoever thinks they're still in or not? In other words, what do you think about the conditions that the Democrats looked at, the potential field, and the motivations of the individuals themselves that came up with this particular slate? All of us could probably think of a handful more of Democrats who they could think might have had a better chance to be in at this point, or a handful that are up there now who you're still thinking, what are they thinking? So I think that's what I'd like to focus on first. Anyone can take a stab, but what are the conditions that the potential field was looking at to say this might be a good year for me to run? Or what's the atmospherics? And then what were some of the personal motivations as you see it of those that we're seeing? How many will be in the November 20th debate? 11. So pick any of them that are the less than baker's dozen. Sure. And your mic's on. It should go green.
I'll swing first. There are a couple of stage setters I would encourage everybody to think about. Most people in this room will have given this some thought, and that is that while we're certainly in an era where you're afraid to make a prediction based on historic trends, because that's what we've all been trained to do and that's been blown out of the water, there are still some historic trends that are real, right? For Democrats, this was an open election where everybody gave it thought. What was different about it was because Donald Trump ran, and so the ceiling or the bar was completely gone for who should run. Previously, a potential candidate would have measured themselves against history. Is this an okay time for me to run? And they would have decided yes or no based on a variety of things. And this year, the answer was, why not? The rules are broken about who can run, so why shouldn't I run, right? And then it became the other 5 questions that many of us in this room have sat around a kitchen table with a potential candidate and their family and answered. Disruption to your life, commitment, where's your career going? The second thing I would suggest to you that's still the same is it's a numbers game. And successful candidates who run for president have a path planned. They have someone like Rob or Joel at the table with them, talking through the concept of what it takes to get the number of votes in a series of primaries and caucuses, and can they do that? Is there that? And, by the way, should the field or the conditions change, is there an alternative path? Very few people go in with one path. They go in with really the path they really believe is right, and then a secondary path if they make a distinction, if the field changes. And the third thing that's still true, regardless of what's happened in the last 3 cycles, 3 2-year cycles anchored by a presidential, is that at the end of the day, a field of candidates is relative to the other candidates in the field, right? I would venture to say, as somebody, there is no dog more loyal to Bill Clinton than I am, who was there at the very beginning and wrote it until it was all over. But I have to tell you the truth, and that is if Paul Tsongas had not run for president, I'm not sure Bill Clinton would have ever been president. Because Tsongas put a different end on the spectrum where he was and how he was viewed in a primary, right? And so candidates have to make a decision at some point in the process without understanding the breadth yet, but an assumption of who else will be in. And then while they may have lived politically in one lane, those lines may change slightly based on the field. So that's my condition setting analysis.
There's just one thing I would say. I think Kiki's summed it up well. There's one thing I would add, which is the democratic process on the Democratic side is still wide open in the sense that everybody believes if they can get hot in Iowa, like Jimmy Carter once did, like so many others have since, and they can carry that to New Hampshire and maybe win one more after that, that they can be the nominee. And I think you had a combination of that reality, which is, if you look at history, Barack Obama won Iowa, and everybody was like, oh, he can win. And suddenly he started winning a lot. Jimmy Carter won, John Kerry won, you can go down the list. So you sort of couple that with the fact that you have an incumbent president who looks like, just by the numbers, is not a very strong candidate for re-election. Now, I think he's much stronger than the numbers would suggest, but by the numbers, it looks like he shouldn't be able to win re-election. And so if you take that and you believe, as many do, and I'm not one of these people, but many do believe that Joe Biden can't sort of sustain himself and hold it together until he's nominated, then you've got sort of a very, very, very inviting situation for any candidate that can raise enough money to get on the debate stage. Ironically, it's probably going to be the debate stage qualifications more than anything else that start to winnow this field. And had it not been for those debate stage qualifications, the field probably still would be 24 people and there'd be 2 nights of debates. So I think there are a lot of things that make this a really inviting time to get in, even if you don't really have a chance. As long as you can raise enough money to stay on the debate stage, you can be viable, at least for the first few. But I also think it's going to be, just like it has been so many times before, it's going to happen really fast. And I personally believe it's going to be over after Super Tuesday.
And by the way, one of the best funded primaries ever.
Michael. The best fund. Just before Michael gets going, I wanted to ask this question, which both Kiki and Steve's remarks made me think of, is there also a calculation that for some candidates, well, I won't be president, but I'll be X? I mean, how does that figure in?
I'll go quickly before having traveled on 2 vice presidential nominee planes. People who run for president so they can be vice president, they don't go very far. Now, that may be the outcome in certain cases for some people. As you know, Al Gore ran for president in 1988 and was picked in 1992, but not until 1992. I don't think most people disrupt their life. In fact, you're a lot cleaner and safer to get picked as a vice presidential nominee and make it through a vetting process if you don't have a record in the primaries, particularly trashing the man or woman who beat you. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would have been a smart thing for Kamala to do, for instance. But I think she may have blown that in that debate when she went after Biden, if he's the nominee.
Yeah, great. Michael?
Thank you. Far be it from me to handicap the Democratic primary process, although it's been fun to watch. I must admit, I've enjoyed it tremendously. Though I think one of the interesting features that this group of candidates says to me is a sort of a mixed identity. One part, we've got a bench of candidates who can run for office. But then at the same time, a lot of the folks that are on that bench should not be running for president. They should be running for other offices. And so that's been an interesting dynamic. And you've heard in recent months a number of Democrats speak to that particular reality. Why don't you get out of the race and run for the U.S. Senate? Let's look at this in tandem with other opportunities. It's not just about defeating Trump. It is also about beating Mitch McConnell. And why is that important? Because the one thing after 3 debates, the Supreme Court and federal judiciary has not been a priority for any of these candidates, at least not in the questioning and the answering. Whereas on the other side, that has been a primary focus for several terms. And it has been a stair-step effort going back to before I was national chairman. And certainly when I was chairman, it was an argument that we made at the state and local levels to win some state legislative races around the country, to say, okay, if you want to deal with redistricting in a blue state, you need to flip the script. And the only way you're going to flip that script is you're going to have to start looking at these other offices. The Democrats seem to be at once sort of focused primarily up here, where I think their strength is really going to come from here. And the evidence of that is 2018, when you look at the kind of races that were won around the country, again, not necessarily just federal races, but other races where they were able to beat fairly strong conservative candidates who were actually proven not to have been that strong after all, because they were challenged on bread and butter issues, not just health care, but traffic lights and trash collection. I mean, very, very domestic, if you will, items. So there's a lot of play there for these candidates, and a number of them do speak street, which is a term that I use, meaning they speak to everyday common folk in everyday common language. And it resonates, and then others don't, and that's some of the dynamic how some stay in. What manifests that even more so, which is an interesting point that goes to both Steve and Kiki's point about the bench overall, is the ability to play with social media so effectively. That's keeping a lot of these candidates around a lot longer than they would be otherwise. Because the truth of the matter is, if you look at the dynamic of Pete Buttigieg sitting there with $25 million in the bank, polling 5%. Then you look at Joe Biden, $8 million cash on hand, polling 30%. The voters are already telling you, giving you a sense of where they're lining up in this thing. Doesn't mean it's definitive, but it is one of several road markings that come into play. Then you broaden it out a little further and you look at how the social media piece is kind of playing in this. It's not helping a Beto O'Rourke the way it helps an Elizabeth Warren. So there are all these other dynamics, I think, that are also kind of interesting to watch, and sort of seeing how this field settles down over the next few weeks. This upcoming debate next month will be critical, because it will be, unless they do otherwise, it will be the last time you will have 12 people on the stage. I think the DNC should, if not must, elevate that. It's not at this point. It's not about the money, because the money, these guys are going to raise the money. If I've got a million donors giving me $100,000, give me $100 a month on their credit card, I'm going to be in the play, right? I'm going to be in play. Where you've got to begin to look at is where are these folks in the battleground states of Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada. It's not a national campaign. National polling is BS. It doesn't mean anything. It's not going to give you an indication of anything other than, you're popular or unpopular in California. But guess what? California primary isn't until way later. So why am I going to go spend time there? You've got to sit there and go, how are you doing in these states? And my suggestion to Tom was, you pop that number up to 10% floor. And if you're at a 10% threshold, I don't care where your money is. If you're at a 10% threshold, because your money's going to be there. I mean, it's just going to be there. Then you're beginning to see where the preference of the voters is.
Yeah, it's great to make my inaugural appearance here at the conference. Thanks, everybody, for having me. I wanted to just note three things which touch upon things that we've said so far that I think are three changed elements of the political landscape that are leading to the kinds of wide open races that we're seeing in the 2020 presidential nomination race. So the first is, we live in an era of weak parties. We live in an era of very, very strong partisanship. That is, people vote on the basis of their own partisanship quite reliably. But in terms of the parties being effective gatekeepers, determining who gets to run, who gets the official blessing of party leaders and elites, this is not a time where that is very strong, especially compared to American politics 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so without that gatekeeping force, you get a lot of candidates who are flooding the zone. Second, and Michael gestured to this is an era of small dollar fundraising, and that is the internet. And so without that technology and that development, you wouldn't have the ability, all these candidates wouldn't have the ability to stay alive so long on the basis of raising money through the internet. And so that's another reason why we're seeing so many candidates stick around, as Michael said. And then finally, it's also an era of the culture of celebrity. And while I think a lot of candidates are not necessarily running for vice president, they now see, as did Donald Trump in 2016, that a presidential campaign is not the end of something, but it's a stage in a career that gets you someplace else. So even if any of these candidates is realistically looking at their chances of winning the nomination as being slim to none, what they're calculating is that they're, at least for as long as they're staying in, that they're getting more out of staying in than they do getting out. And so what that tells us when Beto and Steve Bullock and we think John Delaney is still in the race, is that right? Yeah, so, these kinds of candidates who just have essentially zero chance of winning the nomination are sticking in. These are rational, calculating people who are saying to themselves, I'm going to get something out of this if I keep getting the exposure and the kind of credibility that exposure gains me. And so I think that's partly because we are in this era of social media, but it's also because politics has become much more of a celebritized, entertainmentized business, and one where you can do a lot of things while you're running for president, and we're seeing that with a lot of these candidates.
Can I just share some basics? Most of the people in this room have been through this, but for people who are watching, some basics. So one thing that's different this year. So there are several people in this room who have been part of winning teams on the night of Iowa caucuses. You've done it twice. We did it once together in 1988, and you did it with Howard Dean.
No,
Joel,
he didn't win
I'm sorry, not I. Sorry. On to the next line of states. So we've had folks in this room, but there are two things to remember. Not everybody who went on to become the nominee won Iowa or participated. Bill Clinton drove around it and said, thank you very much. Tom Harkin was the favorite son. Mm-hmm. There's a different function happening with New Hampshire, where you have Senator Sanders as the upstairs neighbor and Senator Warren as the downstairs neighbor. There are friends on candidates I have counseled that they should have just left Iowa. Iowa ain't their friend, and you can pull it out. But what's different this time is this historic concept that you could fly below the radar, not well known, and work in a solid, concentrated place like Iowa, like President Carter did, and then pop out and become known. All the candidates are known now. But you can still, with a field of 14 now, you can still operate below the level, and somebody could be operating in a grassroots performance way that we don't see yet in the state of Iowa. Mm-hmm. Buttigieg is up to 13 in Iowa, okay? And there is a strategy for being everybody's second best in Iowa, right, that will allow you to have it. But here's the other thing. Traditionally, in the Democratic Party, for most of the cycles, you have gone Iowa, New Hampshire within a week to 2 weeks, South Carolina right after that, and then about a month to Super Tuesday, when Super Tuesday became part of the modern culture. It's in 4 weeks now. So unless you had the money and the structure now already going in Super Tuesday states, you could be a poor candidate like Dick Gephardt was, and you could win Iowa and get a pop. He couldn't make it further than that, but some do. And you have time to raise the money and get your infrastructure in place for Super Tuesday. There's none of that. So I think you will see a nominee who already has the money, if not the numbers. There's no way somebody who's not already active in the Super Tuesday states can pull it off. There's somebody who could be low in the numbers in Iowa or New Hampshire and high in money and still pull it off.
But we're seeing who we're going to see, is your point.
I'm not willing to say that yet this year.
Right.
Nope, I'm not willing to say that.
Oh, she's been talking to Hillary.
Right.
But do you have something you'd like to? Do you have something you'd like to
You just
tell
had
us?
to set every freak conspiracy theorist
Do you have
off on
something
me.
you'd like to share?
Only that you're taking calls for her, I understand. And McMahon's cell number is. I'm just kidding.
Hold that spot. So that you've a number of you have touched on this, that there's always a number of variables that determine what's going on in primaries, and we haven't even had one yet. All we've ever seen are people performing in debates, raising money, which may or may not be important as a proxy, and polls. But maybe historically, what was important in the mix of variables, and maybe that's not the same for 2020, but is it ground game? Is it performance in debates? Is it percentage of money from what kind of donors? Percentage of money, and then from what kind of donors? As you as pros who have been in and around this, is it all of those, some more than others? What are you watching to handicap who might emerge among those factors?
I read local clips. I don't care about the national polls.
So this is Iowa, New Hampshire. All right. What does that tell you, Kiki, reading the local?
Well, it's local reporting. It's their performance on the ground. They're not in the debates.
But what do those reading of clippings show you right now?
Well, what they show is that there are people who are, you go through cycles, particularly in Iowa, right? Senator Warren's in a great place right now.
Yeah.
And the question is, how long does she ride that wave? Or does everybody, and not because she does anything wrong, there's just an organic cycle to, does she come back, right? It's my understanding from talking to folks in Iowa that Senator Booker has a tremendous ground organization. I've had 3 different people cite it to me. I'm not there. I don't know, but it makes me want to read local press and see what events look like for him and pay attention to that.
Anybody else weighing in on what are you looking at?
Well, I mean,
Or think maybe I don't have the whole list.
So
Someone else
it's
we should be watching.
So I would if you're looking at ground game in Iowa, I think the 2 candidates that I hear the most about are Warren and Buttigieg, and they've got a ton of money. They've got a huge organization. They've been building it for quite a long time. One of them has more momentum than the other. Elizabeth Warren is, filling auditoriums and gyms all over Iowa. I don't know about Buttigieg's crowds, but I presume they're very good. Joel can talk to us a little bit about that when he's up here. And so I think that one of the things about Howard Dean, Kiki mentioned his campaign back in 2004. He didn't really lose it in the airwaves or externally. He lost it because when we actually went back and checked to find out how many actual ones we had, which you rate your caucus attendees based on how likely they are, 1 to 5. So ones are the best. We thought we had 70,000 ones, and we went through it a month before the election, and it turned out we only had about 12,000. And it's like, holy shit, how did that happen? And how are we going to get another 58,000 really fast? And the answer is we weren't, and we didn't. And so the ground game in Iowa especially is really important. Coming out of Iowa is where the momentum is either formed or not. Kiki's right. We did the Gephardt campaign years ago. The whole strategy was to win Iowa and be a rocket ship.
Money. We had less money than anyone in the game.
Yeah, and we won Iowa and went to New Hampshire. It's like, okay, well, now we're going to win. And we didn't win New Hampshire. And then went to South Dakota. Actually won South Dakota. I don't know if you remember that. But then just ground down Super Tuesday. We didn't have anything. So having the money to sustain your operation over the long term is really important. Having a ground game in Iowa to win the caucus is really important. The calendar this time, as Kiki points out, is going to favor somebody, or it's going to give somebody an opportunity to put it away early. I think if Biden...
Tuesday, Michael said too, right?
Yeah, if Biden doesn't collapse, it will be Biden. I think he's the only one who could put it to bed early. But
well, we're going to open it up in no time at all.
I'll go on the record. I love Vice President Biden, but I don't think it's...
No, I'm not saying he will. I'm saying he's the only one who... Because of the way the delegate rules work, it favors somebody like Biden, which we can get into later, but...
So switching from the candidates to the primary voters, and we'll do... I think I've got one more question or so for the panelists, and then with this group not standing on ceremony and not being shy, just with any of the questions mentioned or ones I haven't thought of, we'll invite participation. So we have plenty of time for that. But switching from the candidates to the voters, and perhaps hard to characterize as a pool, what are the Democratic primary voters looking for?
I think a better question is, who are the Democratic primary voters?
That's a good one, too, and then we would know what they're looking for, maybe. Who and what? Open to your insights into that.
I mean, I think you can divide these voters roughly into 2 groups, and with some overlap, but maybe not that much. One is who's going to beat Trump, and 2 is who's going to be the most ideologically pure. And so, again, there's some overlap there, but I think what you're generally seeing is 2 narratives where you've got folks who are looking at, say, Warren and Sanders and saying, who is the closest to the idealized democratic socialist kind of candidate. And then you've got a lot of voters looking at whether it's Klobuchar or Biden or Buttigieg or Cory Booker and saying, is this a person who can beat Donald Trump? I think that those are the 2 big narratives I see out there right now.
My take in talking to a different collection of voters at various points, it's interesting. My assessment is the Democratic primary voter is much more pragmatic than they're being given credit for. I think that they are not hard and fast to falling in love. I think they're adopting some of the old Republican attitude of, okay, practically and pragmatically, how should we look at this election? And they're trying to contextualize this idea of beating Trump with desires in other areas, which, whether it's on a policy issue or something like that. But they still come back to this very pragmatic idea of who is in the best possible position to do the thing that we need done. And I think my take, and I've been saying this on air in various speeches around the country for the last 6 or 8 months, that the assessment that I've come to is this battle that you refer to, Pat, is not as fraught broadly as it is more narrowly. So in other words, you have a younger collection of voters who want, this more passionate, progressive, in-your-face politics. But the vast majority of the Democrats are made up of something other than that. And they're looking at not for who's going to run to be the future of the Democratic Party. They're looking at who's going to run to be the transition away from Donald Trump. So it's not just about beating Donald Trump. It is about transitioning the country back to a space in which we can get our footing, our bearing again, and then get prepared for the battles and subsequent elections that talk about the future of the country. I know among a lot of center-right independents and certainly a lot of center-right Republicans, that's the space where we kind of find ourselves. I'm not really ready to throw down with Democrats on health care. Now, if you want to have that debate, you're going to lose the election, particularly given what you're proposing.
We tried this weekend with you, too. We tried to talk you into it.
Right. I know. I'm just like, okay, you want to have it? Let's have it. But let me tell you how this is going to end. Because that's not where the country is. And everything that you need to fight for and over is between the East Coast and the West Coast. It ain't on the coast, baby. It ain't there. And so you can play that game and you can have these sort of ideological bouts inside the party. Look, I've been there. I've been in the room. I sat down with Tea Party. I know what this fight looks and sounds like. And I know how it can translate on the ground. Christine O'Donnell. And I know how it should translate on the ground. Chris Christie winning New Jersey at a time when no one thought it was possible. All right, so there is that space in which you operate, in which you really need to understand who your voters are and what they're saying to you. Voters will always tell you what they're thinking. Those of you who poll them, talk to them, know. They will tell you, really in the end, what they're thinking, how they're feeling. And my estimation right now is that they're looking for someone who's going to transition us back to sanity, away from crazy, and then set up this ideological, political, philosophical battle for another election. Because that's not what I don't think the people are really interested in right now. Because you're not going to have, how do you have that battle successfully if it is a more progressive, if the response to, as some would put it, the response to Barack Obama is Donald Trump. You need to understand why that is and what it is. All right?
Can I raise something? Because I'm going to challenge Dr. Egan. I think, we know Senator Sanders had said he's a Democratic socialist. I think Senator Warren would challenge your characterization of her politics. And I don't work for her, and I'm not on her campaign, but I think it's important to draw a line. I think what we're in is a battle over populism. And I actually believe that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump politically, it's a circle, it's not a stick, and the back ends meet. Exactly. And the question, this goes to the question of who are the Democratic voters. The voters who are going to win either election or influence it the most are going to be the populists who are figuring out where they're most comfortable to be. And it doesn't have to be at a Warren, who I think is campaigning as a populist. It doesn't have to be at a Sanders. The question is that we are in a populist moment in our country. And the question is, where are center-right voters who feel comfortable enough with a Democratic nominee that they can capture the economic opportunity function of what populism should be, but not negate a global view of the world to enhance economic structure. And I think the same is true for those who sit. So I think it's different than the traditional third, and the swing vote in the middle, right? This is a different characterization. I think your point about the weakness of parties is right. I think critical to the selection of the Democratic Party for any of the nominees is where African American voters go. And I say that not because they are historically Democratic Party voters. In fact, they haven't been historically strong enough Democratic Party voters. In 18, they were. But the question is, will the younger generation, where will they assign themselves in this fight? They're not necessarily assigned. They're not necessarily, the affinity with the party is not necessarily there, but with the candidate it could be. And so I think it's a different kind of fight, if you will. And I don't think it's a traditional moderate, middle of the, lefty. It's not that function. You could have a populist Democrat step up to the plate, challenge Donald Trump, but offer their populism in a way that makes everyone comfortable that it will be a responsible populism and not a hate-based populism or a populism that says the only way to be successful is if someone's right and someone's wrong, right? And right now, I would say that Donald Trump's populism is there's a right way and a wrong way. He changes what's right and wrong as the leader of his party. I don't mean that's not meant as that's a critical analysis. So he chooses to define what's right and wrong for his party right now, but it is a right and wrong. I think people are afraid of that by any of the candidates, whether it's a centrist governor like Bullock or it's a far more liberal Senator Warren.
Yeah, the two candidates, Kiki, your point about wrap it around and you've really got Bernie and Trump, they were the two people who really, I think, interchangeable, the system is rigged. Yeah. And if you start with that premise that the system is rigged, and Bernie said it before even Donald did, and then around. Now, Elizabeth, interestingly, falls somewhere like, well, it's kind of rigged sometimes, but to your point, can I fix it responsibly without blowing up
Well, and I think the best kind of candidate who can challenge the comfort zone, honestly, is somebody like a Pete Buttigieg, right? He's not a big finger pointer of you're right or you're wrong. No. He can be quite intense in his positions, but he creates a different kind of zone.
It's not the politics.
And that's why I think you could see somebody like him surprise the field.
It's not the politics of the aggrieved, which comes with the system is rigged. But speaking about parties, I'll ask this last question, and then we should open it up for comments. In the context of weak parties, which I agree, putting our political science hat on, and then another from political science. I mean, we've been waiting for a partisan realignment since the New Deal, right? It was supposed to come every 30 years, and we're now like a century later. This is political scientists. But are we seeing the beginning of a partisan realignment with the Democrats basically losing the white, non-college educated core that they used to have, and actually the Republicans losing, and then Democrats gaining educated? If you look at the education level, it's the great divider in a lot of the...
Among white voters.
Among white voters. Yep. Education is totally whether they have a college degree or not, I think Joe will tell us. And actually Democrats gaining among the more well-off, college-educated, suburban men and women, perhaps. But, Dr. Egan, are we on the cusp of a partisan realignment once we shake this out and look at it?
I would give that a tentative yes, and I think I've had conversations with a number of you this last couple of days. I mean, this is not just a U.S.-based phenomenon. We are seeing an urban-rural divide, an educated, less educated divide happening across the West, and that has something to do with changes in technology and globalization. I think those are probably the two biggest drivers here. So parties all over the West are realigning in this way too. So you see this in Britain, where the Labour Party is trying to decide: are we the party of the educated globalists, or do we stay close to our roots of the working class? Right. And so I think that development is happening slowly but surely in the United States, and certainly my best guess is that it would be going forward.
No, there's no question that there's an increasing divide that you can see, and I would actually argue that it's cultural, it's urban, it's rural, and it's education, a lot more than it's left-right. And one of the reasons that Donald Trump was able to become president is because he was able to take advantage of that fact, and it's still a fact. And one of the things that I think Democrats have to be aware of is at some level, the more appealing that you are on the coast, the more threatening you are in the middle of the country. And finding that right balance is a really important thing for one of these candidates to do.
I think to dovetail on Steve's point, I think a big part of it, in addition to those cultural and political and other elements, is the economic piece. That sort of drives all of those other data points. So, because if I'm not economically positioned, then my educational opportunities are somewhat limited. If I'm not economically positioned, then culturally I'm kind of off to one side or the other. I'm not really being able to participate in the way that others are able to participate. So there's an economic piece here that Trump was very successful at defining. With the whole idea of building the wall there's so many little elements and storylines that came off of that spoke to people. It wasn't just about, we're going to build this big wall. It spoke to, okay, I'm build the wall and you'll get a job. I'll build a wall and we'll restore manufacturing in your community. I'll build a wall and you'll be able to, do some of these. I'll build a wall and, all the environmental issues will go away. Climate change, all that stuff will dissipate just by building the wall. And so you have the symbolism of the wall being a manifestation of a lot of the economic frustration that a lot of people in the middle of the country have and concern. I mean, if you're living in Missouri, if you're living in Ohio, you're more concerned about the Canadians than you are Mexicans, right? You should be. I mean, if you're talking about borders, but the truth of the matter is, it's like, oh my God, this is great migration from the South is going to sweep up to the middle of the country and wipe out all white communities. Oh, that brings me to the other side of this racial piece that is very, very important as well, this idea of other. And the clearly changing demographics of the country that, to be honest, more people are going to look like me than y'all. And then that becomes, wait a minute, how does that then impact who makes economic decisions? How does that impact who makes cultural and political decisions? So all of a sudden you're seeing black and brown people in positions of power. And as I say to folks all the time, yeah, you can have this great demographic shift and change, but economically, who's still making loans? Economically, who's still redlining neighborhoods? Economically, who's still putting money in the bank account for you, meaning you have a job or not have a job? So that's the tension. And to Trump, he spoke to that part of white America that said, okay, we get behind you because you're going to be the force to keep all this other bad stuff from happening, which is what Hillary tripped up on when she sat down with coal miners. And she was being honest and direct, but that's not what they wanted to hear. All right, they wanted to hear, you're going to keep this legacy going for us folks here in the mining country, right? That's what you're going to do. And so Trump came and said, yeah, I'm going to do that, knowing damn well that's not what's going to happen. So you've got on the back end of this, which is going to be another truth, how do you then re-educate and get people prepared for the next iteration of what the economy looks like? So there are all these little dynamics between race and the economy and the economics that I think are going to be driving a lot of what happens politically in the country.
I don't think it's political realignment anymore because the lines are vanishing. So when you look at success, particularly in electoral politics now, I'm paying a lot of attention to somebody like Ry Barkott and With Honor, right? They focused on House races last year, both sides. They were not a one-side team, right? Supporting veterans who signed a pledge to work across the aisle. I think about Fix US and Maya McGinnis and what they're trying to do at the local level in the economic messaging around the country. So it's a different alignment without the partisan definition anymore. It's going to be a cultural, and when I say cultural, that includes economics, meaning it's not institutional, right, a cultural realignment as opposed to a political
It's a
institutional
little
one.
hard to see what it looks like, but that's the point. We're kind of looking through a glass
Yeah.
darkly. So let's turn it over to anybody in the audience who either wants to react to something said, ask a question I didn't think to ask within my time limit, or observations of your own.
I knew Joel was going to
The Super Tuesday point.
microphone.
Just so you can
On the
hear
Super
voice.
Tuesday point, neither Kiki or Steve or both. You mentioned the delegate rules, but the rules have fundamentally changed in this cycle. There are no winner-take-all primaries. You have to get a 15% threshold to get delegates, which may make it much, and then there's a reapportionment
I know.
See, I
of
think it
those. So doesn't that make it harder to get this resolved on
I
Super
think it goes
Tuesday?
long. I disagree with Steve. I
So
think
let
it
me
goes long.
let me make
Make your
my
case.
argument for a second.
Fun part.
So here's why. So let's just take most of the recent polling, the real clear polling averages, where Biden's somewhere in the 30s, and then Elizabeth Warren is in the 20s, and Pete Buttigieg is.
But that's national polling.
Hold on 1 second. Hold on. Do you want to answer? No. So let's just take a hypothetical, okay? You have a situation with 12 or 15 or 18 candidates where only one person gets to 30 and one other person gets in the 20s, and most of the candidates are 15 or below, which means all those candidates get 0 delegates. And let's just to make it easy for a second, let's say that Elizabeth Warren gets 20, Biden gets 30, and everybody else is 15 or below. They walk out of that state with 60% of the delegates for Biden, 40% for Elizabeth Warren, and 0 for everybody else. Now, I'm not suggesting Mayor Buttigieg is going to be a 0, but what I'm saying is there aren't going to be very many people over 15. And ironically, that rule that we're talking about now is called the Jesse Jackson rule. And it was invoked, or it was passed at the convention in 1984 to protect minority and underdog candidates from an overwhelming favorite. And it's going to have the opposite effect, because everybody who runs and gets 14, and they can get 14 all day long, is going to get nothing. And somebody who gets 30 could end up with 50 or 60% of the delegates by getting 30. That's where I think the Vice President has a huge advantage. Now, I'm not saying he's going to end it on Super Tuesday. I'm saying he's the only one who could, if he could keep that 30-35 going into Super Tuesday and beyond. And it's going to be, somebody has to get into a position so that when those delegates are getting reallocated, they're going to be competitive. Barack Obama in 2008, because it was a 2-candidate race, and Bernie Sanders in 2016, because it was a 2-candidate race, Bernie could lose 55-45 and still get almost as many delegates as Hillary. But you can't do that anymore if you got 12 candidates getting 10%.
Joel, I got this. Hang tight.
Take it.
So you can't use the national polls in the states.
I know,
And the numbers.
Look at Iowa, Kiki. What are the numbers in Iowa right now?
The numbers are in Iowa that Buttigieg just
I know.
moved up to 13. He made a 6-point
He's
jump.
He's at
right?
13. So
But
how many
that's
delegates
today,
does that
but
get?
that's a trend today.
I
Is my
understand.
point. So
I
I think
understand.
you're way too early to commit to the fact that they're going to be
not
done.
committing. I'm just-
Lisa's laughing at us because we're fighting over this.
No,
we had our first one in Iowa together. Okay, but let me take this one step further. I do believe that the field gets narrowed very quickly, but I think it is the potential for a long battle to the very end, because I think these states could swing a lot differently from state to state. And by the way, thank you, President Obama, not really, thank him for a lot of other things, but not this. People should go pay attention to what the rules are at the convention. Because all those super delegates who got stripped of their power, guess
don't
what?
get to vote.
They are not stripped on the second ballot.
Yeah, but how many are there? 300?
Enough to make a difference if
So-
you're that close.
So
I just don't think it's as clean as you think it
my
is.
rebuttal now. Just take a look at what percentage of the total delegates will be awarded within the first 5 weeks. It's about 65%.
Oh, the vast majority, no doubt about it.
And so if somebody doesn't break through immediately, they're not going to be able to be the nominee.
I just think that if you still have 4 to 5 candidates when you go into Super Tuesday, 4 to 5, right? I think it's legitimate. You could have 4. You might even have 6.
Who's going to get out?
I mean, we need a napkin so we can make our really educated
We're
discussions.
going to get a napkin out later.
And we're going to do
Let's go
that.
to a different question.
But
We'll get napkins
but
at
the
break.
point is that it could be still pretty splintered.
I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm saying it could easily happen where somebody gets 30%, 30%, 30%, 30%, and has the nomination relatively quickly.
That could happen.
I love this part. This is so much
But
fun.
wait, Michael, you should know, we're not fighting about the
I know
issues.
you're not.
We're fighting about math.
I know you're doing. You're fighting over the math, which is making it even more enjoyable. Because again, I make the practical argument. You're making a process argument, and I actually think Steve's argument is a little bit closer to the practical side of this than the process side of it, and that's again, I think the voters. I'm going to just put it out here, just go out on a limb and say, I think the voters are already beginning to make up their mind who they want. I don't think there's a whole lot of runway left in this primary process, to be honest with you. Despite where it is, I think that's starting to sort of get to this point where they're going to settle on 2, no more than 3.
And they are, drum roll please.
I'm not answering that.
We know who
question.
they are.
We don't know who they are.
We know who they are.
We know who they are.
It's Biden, it's Warren, it's Buttigieg.
Yeah.
And Buttigieg, no.
Rob, that felt good to say it, didn't it? I know.
But
I think
I'm the
Biden-
Republican, so what do I know?
But of any candidate in the race, it's Bernie who has a floor, right? I mean, if you look at any poll, when you say who's your first choice, who's your second choice, if you look at the Bernie first choicers, like so many of them say, I have no second choice.
Right.
Yeah,
Well,
they are Bernie in.
Bernie has a floor and a ceiling.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
He has a
Yeah,
floor and a
but I
ceiling,
think
and he
he's
lives
at 15
here. And he at some
throughout.
point is going to
Yeah.
have to make a decision. I'll leave that alone. He's going to have to make a decision about what he's going to do. But you cannot make an assumption that Bernie's voters will perform in any specific way for anyone else.
Right, exactly.
And
Exactly.
so these other
Right.
candidates have to go build what they know they can get access to. Because they don't, even Elizabeth Warren does not know that she can get access to his.
That's right.
That's right.
Yes, Rob.
I won't ask the question, what if Trump tells the Republicans in the South Carolina primary to go vote for somebody in the Democrat primary? We don't that to save Kiki and Steve the fight. I had a question.
I think we're in agreement on that
I
one.
think it's a closed primary, so
Not South Carolina. I don't think so. Anyway, I'm just kidding. I had a question. I don't watch it as closely as you do. It's really a two-parter. Are you seeing any campaigns doing some really interesting, cool things, either with technology or message or grassroots that you think is really cool? And two, I always look for campaigns that kind of form a national movement, hope and change, make America great again. It feels to me, as a Republican, that this is almost like everyone's running to be president of the College Democrats. It just seems like a race to the left, like they're checking boxes. So I'm asking, do you see anybody who might be able to build that kind of national kind of message, or are you seeing the seeds of it that you think is? So I'm trying to figure out who's being innovative and who might be able to grow into a national candidate.
You want to go?
well, so I would say,
Cool stuff first.
I
being cool?
the cool stuff. I think Pete Buttigieg is being cool because he doesn't have an obvious constituency, frankly. I mean, so there's not an ideologically obvious constituency for him because he's a pragmatic progressive, but he's not, Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. So you can see easily why Bernie and Elizabeth Warren are raising a ton of money online. They're left. And then you've got, Biden, who is the front runner. And then you've got Pete, who kind of occupies this space in between. And he's raised an enormous amount of money. He's been incredibly impressive, I think, in just about every venue where I've seen him perform. Had a really good debate last time. Joel Benenson prepped him for that debate. And I think he's in a great position to sort of inherit things if Biden falls apart. Because I don't think the Biden voter is probably ideologically is a Warren Sanders voter. And I think Pete's really done some interesting stuff. The amount of money he has is remarkable, and he's just been pretty impressive.
I'll give you 3 little examples of what's interesting. I don't think there's any new breakthrough technology right now, Rob, in this one. This is not like Obama, who everybody had their doors. Now we all pay our checks at a restaurant at the table. Well, those were actually the original Obama hard count machines they were doing at the doors. But a couple of things are different this time that I've seen that I think are sort of interesting. One, because Warren had so much volunteer support and so many young people come to her very quickly, very early on, It's my understanding they had to build some real infrastructure. They created a fellowship program. They've got, a campaign can get overwhelmed with the number of people, and then you lose them and you don't capture the energy. From a management point of view, what I've seen is they put real programs together to capture this energy of young people so that everybody has a title and a role and wherever they are. And she put a group of fellows together, and you had to apply for the fellows. So there was some cool stuff happening that way. The second thing, I had a talk, and this was as early as maybe March, when all the launches were just happening and the first road shows were happening, because these events in Iowa and New Hampshire are so big for all of them, right? Even in the early days, Gillibrand was getting 100 people in a room, which on your first trips to Iowa and New Hampshire in the old days, you got 20 people in somebody's living room was a big deal, right?
Maybe.
And so what was happening is in these small states where voters are used to a lot of contact, you're not getting the contact, right? Because Kamala Harris has 1,000 people in a big church hall, and she can't get to him. What I heard from reporters was that fewer events were being scheduled, not to protect, but because Cory Booker and Kamala Harris and those guys are sticking around like Bill Clinton used to do for 2 hours, doing a selfie with every person in the room, shaking a hand with every person. That's a different dynamic. Instead of lots of little small events, there are these bigger one events, but then because of social media, it's worth it to stay put for the extra 2 hours, not only to pay respect to the voters in the room, but think about the amplification off of that moment. So there are a couple of, I think, different, but I wouldn't say, the fundraising, that kind of stuff. And then there are a couple of the guys who have less money, who are hoarding it in the hopes that there's a collapse and they can go catch some crumbs. And then the last person, I'd give you an example. I think I don't know if it was intentional, but I'll say it was and give her credit. I think Klobuchar was brilliant to hold her powder through the first few debates and wait and come in louder, stronger on this last one. People actually paid attention to her.
At that Elizabeth Warren rally at Washington Square Park, to Kiki's point, she got about 20,000, but everyone said 20,000 people. I could certainly hear it and see it. It was a lot. Interestingly, though, not many minorities in the young, but it was a very white audience, just anecdotally. Her speech started at doors opened in Washington Square Park at 4:30. She started her speech, Miss Discipline, at 7, ended at 8, and stayed till 11:45 taking selfies under the arch. So
that's grassroots now.
But that's pretty grassroots. And I think you got the last comment, Michael.
Yeah,
just break and then go. We come back here at 3:45.
Just real quick on the tech side of it, that raises two issues that I think are important for Democrats to sort of focus on. One of them rests with the idea that while you're right, Kiki, on the Democratic side, there may not be a whole lot of new, sexy, hot stuff. There should be, because on the Republican side, there is. The dynamics that are being employed by the RNC and the other committees through the Trump campaign, which is now a wholly owned subsidiary of all of those other entities, they're doing some really, really impressive mining of voters. You wonder where you.
I think we're doing that. I think our side's doing.
Well, if you're doing it, then you're doing it in a new way. You have to do it in a new way because you've got to figure out where you're going to get your voters from. You've got to figure out what Republicans figured out in 2016, and that was to find that 30-year-old absent voter, meaning the voter who's been absent from the political process for 30 years, and get them off their ass into the polls.
Yeah.
If you're not doing that, you're not going to win this election, because the truth of the matter is not only is Trump, he's confident in his numbers because he knows what they're doing, not only to keep that voter engaged, but to get the one who didn't get off the couch in 16 and give them a reason to do so in 20. And they're doing that. The other thing that I think is very interesting from sort of the hot, sexy tech side of it is what Andrew Yang has been able to do. A lot of folks in the Democratic Party are not paying attention to that young brother. They should. Because he has been able to take that social media component and flip it on its head. He's doing a lot of the stuff that we saw Howard Dean do at the dawn of that stage, and he's just magnified it. And yeah, you got the gimme. I'm gonna give everybody $1,000, but it's what I know on the campus I teach at Brown. The movement among young voters is strong, it's real, and it's translatable. And it ain't translating necessarily for all the other folks y'all talking about. It's translating for him. So you got to figure out how you capture that and what it is he's doing that you can then, at that critical moment, as both of you mentioned, where the stage narrows down to 2 or 3, and that vote, you may not care where Klobuchar's vote go. You may not be so concerned about where Bennett's vote go. You should be concerned where Yang's vote goes, because that's going to be the basis, form the basis, I think, for helping you chisel in all those other pieces that you're going to need.
We would be remiss if we did not mention this before we close the panel. We do not know what role foreign corrupt behavior in our election will be. We just don't know what it is.
Right.
And
Right.
it's wrong to not acknowledge that it's out there.
Okay, well, great.
Thank you.
Great panel, getting us off to
Thank
a
you,
great
guys.
start. Think of this, panelists. You started the Athens movement right now. We're going to call it that.